The rain poured heavily that evening, drenching the streets in a cold, relentless downpour. The city was alive with the usual chaos: honking cars, rushing pedestrians, and flickering streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Among the crowd, a man stepped out of a sleek black car, his polished shoes splashing in a small puddle. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, glancing at his watch. His name was Daniel Carter, a self-made millionaire, known for his sharp business acumen and an even sharper attitude toward life. To him, the world was a place where success belonged to those who fought for it. As Daniel made his way toward his usual upscale restaurant, something unusual caught his attention. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, a young boy sat on the sidewalk, his knees pulled to his chest, his body trembling from the cold. His clothes were worn out, his face streaked with dirt, and his eyes, those hollow, desperate eyes, were filled with tears. Daniel wasn't the type to stop for strangers, let alone children on the street. His philosophy was simple: the world owed no one anything. But there was something about this boy, something unsettling. Maybe it was the way he clutched his stomach, as if the hunger was eating him from the inside. Or maybe it was the quiet, broken sobs that pierced through the city noise. He could have walked away. He should have walked away. But for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself stopping. "Hey kid," Daniel said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "What's wrong?" The boy looked up, startled. He wiped his face quickly, as if ashamed of his tears, and tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse. I'm just hungry, sir." Hungry. Daniel frowned. He had seen beggars before, con artists even, but this child, he didn't look like someone playing a trick. His hands were too small, his frame too frail. Without another word, Daniel sighed and gestured toward the restaurant. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." The boy hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with both hope and fear. Then, as if realizing he had nothing to lose, he nodded and followed. Inside the restaurant, the warmth was almost shocking after the cold outside. The rich aroma of grilled meat and fresh bread filled the air. Daniel ordered a full meal for the boy, something hearty, something that would actually fill his stomach. As the waiter placed the steaming plate in front of him, the boy's hands shook as he reached for the food. He didn't eat like someone who was merely hungry. He ate like someone who had been starving for days. Daniel watched in silence. He had spent his life chasing numbers, building companies, making deals. But sitting here, watching a child wolf down a simple meal as if it were a luxury, made something stir inside him. Something he wasn't used to. "What's your name?" Daniel asked after a while. The boy paused mid-bite, chewing slowly before answering. "Liam." "Where are your parents?" The boy's eyes darkened. He swallowed hard, then shook his head. "Gone." Daniel felt a strange, unexpected ache in his chest. "Where do you live?" Liam looked away, his fingers tightening around his fork. "Nowhere." Silence hung between them. Daniel exhaled deeply, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but hearing it said out loud, it made everything feel more real. "You've been living on the streets?" Liam nodded, for a while. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying the boy. He had always believed that people made their own luck, that hard work determined fate. But what kind of chance did a kid like this have? He was barely old enough to tie his own shoes, let alone survive on his own. An unexpected thought crossed Daniel's mind. What if he helped? Really helped? He had the resources. It wouldn't take much, just a little money, a little effort. Maybe he could set Liam up somewhere safe, get him into a shelter, even find him a school. It was just an idea. But before he could say anything, Liam suddenly looked up, his face pale. His hands, which had been gripping the fork, trembled slightly. Daniel noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" Liam's eyes darted toward the entrance. His breathing quickened. "He's here." Daniel frowned. "Who?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he dropped the fork, his appetite gone. His shoulders tense, his entire body on high alert. Then, just as Daniel was about to press him for an answer, the restaurant door swung open with a sharp creak. A tall figure stepped inside. His presence alone sent a chill through the air. His eyes were dark, scanning the room with a quiet intensity, and the moment Liam saw him, his entire body went rigid with fear. Daniel had no idea who the man was. But judging by the way Liam gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, he knew one thing for sure. This was no coincidence, and whatever was about to happen next would change everything. Daniel's eyes flickered between Liam and the man who had just entered. The boy looked like he had seen a ghost. His small hands clenched the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. His breathing became uneven, and Daniel could feel the fear radiating off him. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet confidence that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. His clothes were simple but well-worn, and his face carried the kind of hardness that only came from a life filled with struggle. But it was his eyes that unsettled Daniel the most, sharp, calculating, and locked directly on Liam. The boy quickly lowered his head, as if hoping to disappear into his chair. Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Liam, who is that?" The boy didn't answer. His fingers tightened around the fork, and Daniel could see his chest rising and falling rapidly, as if he were preparing to run. Then, the man began walking toward them. Daniel had faced many kinds of people in the business world: powerful executives, ruthless investors, people who could manipulate with a single handshake. But this was different. This man wasn't here for negotiations. His presence carried something darker, something that put Daniel on edge in a way he couldn't explain. "Liam," the man said, his voice rough like gravel. "Come with me." Liam shook his head without looking up. "No." Daniel's instincts kicked in. He straightened his posture, placing an arm protectively on the back of Liam's chair. "Who are you?" The man's gaze finally shifted to Daniel, sizing him up. He gave a slow, almost mocking smile. "Just someone looking for what's his." Daniel frowned. "He's not yours. He's a kid." The man's smile didn't waver. "And what do you think you're doing, mister?" "Carter," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Daniel Carter." Recognition flashed in the man's eyes for the briefest moment. "Ah, the businessman." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, Carter." Daniel ignored the remark. "Liam's not going anywhere unless he wants to." The restaurant had fallen eerily silent. A few diners glanced over, sensing the tension but pretending not to notice. The waiter who had served them earlier hesitated near the counter, uncertain if he should intervene. Liam finally lifted his head, his voice trembling but determined. "I don't want to go with you." Something flickered in the man's expression, annoyance, perhaps even anger. He exhaled sharply and shook his head. "You don't get to decide that." Daniel's patience was wearing thin. "Actually, he does." For a long moment, no one moved. The air was thick with unspoken threats. Then, with a forced smirk, the man took a step back, raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "All right, Carter, enjoy your meal." His gaze returned to Liam, colder this time. "We'll see each other soon." And with that, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, the door swinging shut behind him. Liam let out a shaky breath, his entire body sagging as if he had been holding himself together with sheer willpower. Daniel studied him carefully. Who was that? The boy swallowed hard, his eyes still locked on the door, as if expecting the man to return any second. Then, in a quiet voice, he finally answered. "He's the reason I ran away." Daniel sat back, processing those words. He hadn't planned to get involved in anything complicated. He had simply stopped to help a hungry child. But now it was clear, Liam wasn't just some kid on the streets. He was running from something or someone. And now, that danger had noticed him too. Daniel knew he should walk away. He had his own life, his own problems. But as he looked at Liam, this scared, fragile boy who had no one, he realized something. He wasn't going to turn his back on him. Not now. Not ever. Daniel didn't know exactly what he had just stepped into. But he knew one thing for sure. Liam was in real danger. The way that man had looked at the boy, the fear in Liam's eyes, the way his small body trembled even after the man left. It all told him there was more to this story than he had realized. And now there was no turning back. Outside, The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the city lights reflecting on the wet pavement. Liam still hadn't touched the rest of his food, his appetite seemingly gone. His hands remained curled into fists on the table, his body stiff, as if he were waiting for something bad to happen. Daniel leaned in, keeping his voice steady but firm. "Liam, you need to tell me the truth. Who is that man?" Liam hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. His eyes darted around the restaurant, checking every corner, every shadow. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "His name is Victor. He used to take care of me. But he's not a good person." Daniel frowned. "Take care of you how?" Liam swallowed, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "After my mom died, I had nowhere to go. He found me on the streets and said he'd help. But," he trailed off, his eyes darkening, "he didn't. He used me." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't need to hear more to understand. Liam had trusted someone who had only seen him as an opportunity, someone who had probably used his vulnerability for their own gain. And now, Liam was trying to escape him. "Why is he looking for you?" Daniel asked. Liam shook his head quickly. "I took something from him. Something important." Daniel exhaled. "What was it?" Liam hesitated again, then reached into the pocket of his ragged hoodie. From it, he pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. He slid it across the table, his hands still shaking. Daniel picked it up and carefully opened it. Inside were a few old photographs and a folded piece of paper. The photographs showed a much younger Liam, smiling with a woman, his mother. But the paper was what caught Daniel's attention. It was an official-looking document, worn at the edges, but the words were still clear. Daniel's eyes widened as he read it. It was a legal document, a will, and not just any will. It stated that Liam was the rightful heir to a substantial inheritance left behind by his late mother. Daniel looked up at Liam, realization settling in. Victor knew about this. Liam nodded. "He never told me. I found it in his things. I think he was keeping it from me so I wouldn't leave." Daniel clenched his teeth. Of course, the man had been using Liam, controlling him, making sure he never knew that he had a legal claim to something bigger, something that could have given him a way out. And now that Liam had discovered the truth, Victor wasn't going to let him go so easily. A sudden sharp noise cut through the restaurant, the front door slamming open. Daniel turned, and his stomach dropped. Victor was back, and he wasn't alone. Two men flanked him, their expressions cold and unreadable. The restaurant staff froze, sensing the tension. A few customers quickly paid their bills and left, wanting no part in whatever was about to happen. Victor's eyes locked onto Liam immediately. His lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. "You should have come with me when I asked, kid." Liam gripped Daniel's arm, his body trembling again. Daniel stood, stepping between them. "He's not going anywhere with you." Victor let out a low chuckle. "Carter, you really should mind your own business." Daniel didn't back down. "You're the one who kept this from him, aren't you?" He lifted the document slightly. "You knew he had a right to his mother's inheritance, and you hid it." Victor's smirk faltered for just a second before he scoffed. "The kid doesn't know what to do with money. I was protecting him." Daniel stared at him, disgusted. "No, you were controlling him." The air grew heavier. The two men beside Victor shifted slightly, as if ready to act. But Daniel wasn't a man who backed down, especially when it came to what was right. He reached into his pocket and, without taking his eyes off Victor, placed his phone on the table, screen up. It was already recording. "You want to try something?" Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "Go ahead. But just know, everything you say, everything you do is being recorded." Victor's smirk faded completely. His eyes flicked toward the phone, then back to Daniel. He wasn't stupid. A man like Daniel Carter, with his wealth and influence, could make this situation very public very fast. A tense moment passed. Then, with a slow exhale, Victor took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Yeah," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "It is." Victor shot Liam one last, warning glance before turning and walking out. His men followed without a word. The restaurant door swung shut, leaving only silence behind. Liam let out a breath he had been holding, his shoulders dropping in relief. Daniel picked up the document again and looked at the boy. Liam, you're not alone in this anymore. You're going to get what's rightfully yours. Tears welled up in Liam's eyes, but this time, they weren't from fear. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Carter felt like he had done something that truly mattered.